Many times I've heard the phrase, usually when attacking an American president, well, Hitler was elected too, to disparage, I'm not sure what, to disparage typically the voting public. Well, he frickin' wasn't. Hitler wasn't elected. He wasn't elected to much of anything. I'll show you how he came to power. The short form, he was appointed to power, and people who did it should have known better. The Nazi state grew out of the Weimar Republic, which was the government that was put in place in Germany after World War I. To understand how Hitler could gain dictatorial power, we have to understand how the Weimar Republic works. So here we go. So first, how elections are done in Weimar Germany. Voting is national, not by state or the equivalent. And the voting was done for a political party, not for an individual candidate. There was a separate election for the legislature, known as the Reichstag, and for the president, who for most of this period is Paul von Hindenburg. So people would vote for the party, and the party poobahs would pick the individuals who would go into the legislature. The members were representatives, but really only of the party, and they were usually given a name that didn't mean anything, like representative from so-and-so, which was really just where they lived. The Reichstag worked on the model, really, of the British Parliament. The House of Commons could propose laws, could pass them, could give the upper house, the Reichsrat, which would approve, and then they would become law, and the Reichsrat would always approve. There are two supreme entities in the Weimar Republic. One is the Chancellor, who is equivalent to the British Prime Minister. He's appointed by the other supreme leader, the President. The Chancellor is typically from the party or the coalition of parties in power in the Reichstag. The job of the Chancellor was to enforce the laws, to keep the government going, to oversee the ministries. The Chancellor could remain in his office until a no confidence vote from the Reichstag. If a majority of the Reichstag members voted no confidence, the Chancellor was out, and a new one would have to be selected by the President. Now, in a state of national emergency, the President of the Reich could issue legally binding decrees. They were called decrees, not laws. The decrees were usually based on advice that the President was getting, but didn't have to be. Just whatever he decided should be done was law. The idea was that the President could act as a brake on an out-of-control Chancellor or an out-of-control Reichstag. Since the Depression began, starting in 1930, Germany was continuously through this period in a state of national emergency. And in a national emergency, the Weimar Constitution in Rule 48, we'll hear more about 48 presently, Rule 48 said that the President could rule by decree until the Reichstag got its act in order. So all through this period, it's Hindenburg and a whole plethora of chancellors. Hindenburg had been a field marshal in World War I. He had basically run the country with a guy named Ludendorff for most of World War I. Managed to get people to believe we were backstabbed in World War I, and so was a very popular figure in Germany. So he was a respected president. So new elections could be called whenever the president wanted it or the chancellor wanted it. And that would either be for the chancellor trying to increase his majority or for the president looking to replace the chancellor. If the scoundrels in power couldn't do the job, Hindenburg would find some new scoundrels, basically. So how did Hitler bend this to get himself in absolute power, which he did in a very few years? In February 1920, the Nazis became a formal political party. They could run for the Reichstag. In June 1920, the first election since they formed, was the first chance that the Nazis had to gain seats in the Reichstag. They didn't win any seats. In December 1924, the Nazis won 3% of the vote, and so they had 14 seats in the Reichstag. They actually ran not as the Nazi Party, but as the National Socialist Freedom Party. I don't know. The representatives of the Nazis in the Reichstag did not include Hitler. Hitler was still an Austrian citizen at this point, and so could not serve in the Reichstag. Hitler was not made a German citizen until February 26, 1932. The magic used to make him a citizen are for another time and was pretty shady. So the next election was held in February 1928. The Nazis got 2.6% and 12 seats, so slightly less. In September 1930, another election, the Nazis' vote increased to 18% and gave them 107 seats. It may not look like the numbers are correct, but the Reichstag had grown in this period. On March 13, 1932, was a regularly scheduled election for president. The president's term of office lasted 4 years. Hitler ran against Hindenburg to be president of the Reich. Hindenburg got 49%, Hitler got 30%, the Communists got 13%, and a Veterans Party got 7%. Now, by rule, if you don't get a majority, you have to have a second election. In the second election, Hindenburg got 53%, Hitler got 37%, and the Communists got 10%. So Hindenburg was president again and could continue to rule via Rule 48 because of national emergency. In July 1932, there was another election for the Reichstag. The Reichstag right now was in chaos because nobody had a majority and everybody hated each other. The Nazis got 37% in the vote and got 230 seats, which is still not the majority. Now, Hitler was newly minted as German, so he was put in the Reichstag. And he was also now allowed to be chancellor. So you might think, well, he's in the legislature and looking good. He ain't done, not by a long shot. So chancellors are coming and going with great speed. A guy named Franz von Papen, a former chancellor himself and a self-styled kingmaker, came up with a plan to make Hitler chancellor, but as a figurehead, and that von Papen would control the rest of the government, and that way Hitler would be unable to do anything. Keep him on a leash, and eventually there would be a no confidence vote, and Hitler would go back into obscurity. That was von Papen's plan. Von Papen goes to Hindenburg and says Hitler could be appointed chancellor because von Papen will keep him under control. Hindenburg buys this. So on January 30th, 1933, Hindenburg, who had refused to appoint Hitler chancellor not so long ago and had run against Hitler for president not so long ago, appoints Hitler chancellor. So here's Hitler achieving some of his power by being appointed. He wasn't elected, he was appointed. And we got more to go. On February 4th, 1933, Hitler convinced Hindenburg to decree the Ordinance for the Protection of the German People. So this goes around the Reichstag because it's a presidential decree. This decree allowed the Hitler government to ban the publications of anything that was deemed to be a danger to the people, and also Hitler. So this allows the government to control what other political parties can publish. So they can't whip the people up into support because they can't reach them all. Radio was still a relatively new mechanism, so the only person who really was using it was Hitler. On February 27th, everything went Hitler's way from here on. February 27th, the Reichstag building, the building that the Reichstag meets in, caught fire and burned to a shell of itself. Basically, it was unusable. The police, Hitler's police, found a Dutch communist, guy named Marinus van der Lubbe, to blame. Because he was a communist, they could go to Hindenburg and the Reichstag and say, look, here's a communist uprising. This is the beginning. But it's almost certain that the Nazis were behind the fire and probably carried it out. It just, because of the way things turned out, they're the only ones who make sense. So the day after the fire, February 28th, 1933, Hitler convinces Hindenburg to issue what is known as the Fire Decree, the decree for the protection of the people. So the government now, this is Hitler, is empowered to arrest without warrant and imprison without charge anybody they liked, because this was supposed to stop the communists. So, surprise, they arrested mostly communists. Also, the rights of free speech and assembly were also revoked. So now political parties couldn't even hold rallies. So a week later, on March 5th, 1933, another Reichstag election is called, and the Nazis won only, considering what they've been doing, only 43% of the vote, so 288 seats. So still not a majority. So Hitler, to get the Reichstag to play ball, has to run a coalition government between the Nazis and I'm not making this name up, the Black, White, and Red Struggle Front, which with them and the Nazis, they had a majority. Why would he bother with this? Well, because Hitler wanted to preserve the appearance of legitimacy, the appearance of legality. Even though he was changing the laws behind everybody's back, he still could claim to be acting legally. And everybody let him do it. That was the weird part. The courts could have slowed things down. Somebody could have got to Hindenburg and said, look, this is crazy. Nobody stopped him. Nobody. Now he has a majority in the Reichstag, and he's had all the communists and a bunch of others arrested and imprisoned so they can't vote. So on the 23rd of March, 1933, Hitler places before the Reichstag the law to remedy the distress of the people and the Reich. This is also known as the Enabling Act. The reason it was called that is because Hitler was now allowed, without the Reichstag or really the president. In theory, the president could stop it, but he never did. He could make his own laws, his own legally binding laws. Not decrees, laws. This was passed 444 to 96 because everybody was really afraid of the Nazis. You go against the Nazis and they'll put you in jail. So the Enabling Act was written to run for 4 years until the emergency, was over. But of course, since Hitler was going to control the Reichstag, as we shall see, it was renewed in 1937 and 1941, and probably would have been done in 1945 if everybody wasn't already dead. So Hitler has essentially become the ruler of Germany, although he still has to keep Hindenburg happy. And Hindenburg didn't like Hitler, didn't really like what he was doing, but had been convinced that the only way to maintain the current regime, that is to keep the communists out, was to do what Hitler was doing. So Hitler has still been arresting people and so forth, and one of the things he's done now is outlawed all other political parties. So the easy way to win votes is nobody can vote for anybody else. So the vote was not vote for the Nazis. The vote was, do you support Hitler or not? Yes, no. That's it. He won that by 93%. What a surprise. The real wonder is that 7% of the population voted against him. So now he has a Reichstag that is entirely in his pocket, but there's still Hindenburg to be considered. On August 2nd, 1934, Hindenburg died. Now normally, by the Weimar Constitution, there would be an election to replace Hindenburg, which could just as easily be Hitler or not. But Hitler used his new powers of the law to name himself not only chancellor but president, and began calling himself Der Führer, the leader. So now, not only does he have a Reichstag behind him, he has Rule 48. So now nobody can stop him. Nobody in the Reichstag, because it's all Nazis, and the president, because it's Hitler. So now Hitler, by hook and crook, has made himself absolute ruler of Germany. Not by being elected, but being appointed and convincing people to hand him power. So Hitler has the legislation, the presidency, and the judges, because he makes the laws, in his pocket. There's no way to stop him. No legal way. The only way to stop him would be to kill him, which is what the army tries to do every once in a while. So what interesting things happened after that besides all of World War II? On April 27, 1942, the Reichstag, full of Nazis, gave Hitler the power of life and death without trial. He could have anybody killed for any reason. Sometimes he would still allow trials, sometimes not. But the legal authority to have anyone killed for any reason resided with Hitler. He could make out death warrants and they would be carried out. So how did the chancellery end up? Well, on April 30th, 1945, as Berlin burned to the ground around him, Hitler appointed Karl Dönitz, a naval admiral, the Reich president, and Joseph Goebbels, his minister of propaganda, as chancellor. Then he kills himself because he's passed on the power to somebody. Goebbels will then kill himself, and nobody gets the job. Dönitz is allowed to stay in power even after he's been captured because the Allies thought they needed some kind of German government to convince all of the army to surrender. So finally on May 30th, 1945, over 3 weeks since the Germans surrender, Dönitz is explicitly removed as president of the Reich, and thus ending the Reich. So that's the end of Nazi Germany. That's the end, technically, of the Weimar Republic. So there you are. Hitler got power by literally being a usurper, a liar, and someone who was handed power by people who should have known better. Bye-bye.